Hi, everybody. This is What is the Constitution by Patricia Brennan Demuth, and we're now into part 2 of lesson number 8. We're going to read the text. And so hopefully you have your book there with you, and if not, then hopefully one can fly in at you like this one just did. And please make sure that your brain is engaged and ready to go. So reminding you that when we're reading the chapter, we want to activate our brain by using different reading strategies. We've talked about many of these already, or all of these at some point. Let me remind you that especially helpful it can be to back up and reread when you run into something that you don't quite understand or that startles you or surprises you. And then if there are questions, we always want to look at those first and study them and have them in mind before we start reading. But in this case, there aren't any. So a good way to go is to take the chapter title, in this case, A Battle Between North and South, and change it into a question. So what was the battle between North and South? And hopefully we'll be able to answer that question when we finish reading this chapter. This is a pretty short chapter, so here we go. Chapter 5, A Battle Between North and South. Was the arguing over now? So remember the last chapter was about the Great Compromise. And so that's the question here. Was the arguing over now that they had that compromise? Definitely not. The delegates had settled that population would determine how many members each state would have in the House of Representatives. However, there was the terrible issue of slavery to take into account. Oh, so that's probably what this picture is showing us, that these are probably slaves at work. At the time, there were about 500,000 people in bondage in the United States. Well, I'm going to stop here for a second. So when we use the word bondage back in the old days, that referred to people being enslaved. It was another way of saying somebody living as a slave. So I'll restart. At the time, there were about 500,000 people in bondage in the United States, almost all of them living in the southern states. Southern plantation owners depended on slaves' unpaid labor to farm their fields of tobacco, rice, and cotton. Aha, so that's what's going on here. So this is clearly a tobacco plantation. These large leaves, these are tobacco leaves. And one of the things that I know from having seen tobacco fields is that after they pull the leaves off of the plant, then what they do is they tie them to hang them because they have to dry for a long time. And then after they're all thoroughly dried, then they could be packed up. And so I guess that's what this person's doing here, is he's taking tobacco leaves perhaps and getting them ready to be shipped somewhere else. Slaves had no rights. They were considered property, not citizens of the country. They couldn't vote. Yet, if they were counted in a southern state's population, that state would get many more representatives in the House of Representatives. Of course, that's what southern states wanted. However, the thought of southern states gaining more power in Congress because of their slaves made northern delegates furious. Many of them hated slavery and spoke out against it. Even several framers who were slaveholders, including George Washington and James Madison, hoped slavery would end. That's an odd sentence. Let's go back 2 sentences. Many of them hated slavery and spoke out against it. Even several framers who were slaveholders, so slaveholder is somebody that has slaves, included George Washington and James Madison. So, including George Washington and James Madison, hoped slavery would end. Luther Martin of Maryland declared that the dishonorable slave trade went against the principles of the Revolution. George Mason of Virginia said, "Slavery brought the judgment of heaven down on a country." Slavery also went against the Declaration of Independence, which declared that all men are created equal. But Southern delegates made it clear that they would leave the convention if the new Constitution outlawed slavery. And without the South, there would be no nation, much less no Constitution. So the issue was whether slaves should be counted as part of a state's population. Once again, the delegates struck a compromise. They agreed that the Constitution would say that each enslaved person was counted as only 3/5 of a person. Okay, hold on. Once again, the delegates struck a compromise. They agreed that the Constitution would say that each enslaved person was counted as only 3/5 of a person. So not as a whole person, as 3/5. That's a little more than a half, but that's not a whole person. That's really weird. If you read the Constitution, the word slaves never appears. The delegates avoided using it on purpose. Confusing words such as other persons were used instead. The word slavery was hid away in the Constitution, said the 16th President, Abraham Lincoln, just as an afflicted man hides away a cancer, which he dares not cut out at once, lest he bleed to death. The compromise over slavery kept the convention alive and made it possible to have a constitution. Delegates who hated slavery felt their hands were tied. Yet the Constitution, so successful in other ways, utterly failed African Americans in bondage, so in slavery.